a boot print pressed into the mud on the wrong side of the water. 2 legs, heel deeper than the toe. The kind of print a man leaves when he's carrying something heavy and trying not to slip. The creek ran black between the prints and the cabin, fast and cold and shoulder deep in the middle. Nobody was supposed to be over there. Nobody had been over there for 40 years. A rifle casing lay half buried in the silt near the print, brass green with age, the head stamp faint but readable. The old man on the porch, a quarter-mile west, didn't know about the print yet. He only knew his grandson hadn't come back. He sat with the door open and a rusted bear trap nailed above the frame, watching the tree line. His name was Elias Vance. Stay with me on this one. The cabin sat half a mile up a logging road that hadn't seen a grader since the Reagan years. Elias had built it himself in 1971 with a crosscut saw and a borrowed mule, and he had not slept under any other roof since. The valley around him was Selkirk country, northern Idaho, a green wrinkle of timber and granite tucked up against the Canadian line. He knew every draw and every blowdown. He knew which spring froze first and which one ran clear in August. There was only one place in those mountains he refused to set foot: the east bank of Black Creek. The locals had a name for it: the Black Creek Walker. Some called it a Sasquatch story. Some called it a ghost. Most of them had never seen Elias Vance say more than 2 words on the subject, and the few who pressed him got a look that closed the conversation. He kept a rusted number 4 bear trap nailed above his cabin door. He never said why. Folks assumed it was a trophy. It was not. For 40 years, the rule in the family was simple: no Vance puts a boot on the east side of the creek. His son had honored it. His son's wife had honored it. When the boy was old enough to ask, Elias had told him only that the water was deeper than it looked, and the bottom was full of things that didn't want company. The boy grew up. He left. He came back. His name was Wyatt. He was 29 years old. He had 2 tours in Iraq behind him, and a limp in his right leg that he would not discuss. He drove into the valley on the first warm day of April with everything he owned in the bed of a half-ton pickup and a savings account that wouldn't last him a season. He had nowhere else to go. His grandfather was the only blood he had left who still answered a phone. Elias met him at the gate. The old man was 78 years old, lean as a fence post, with a beard the color of birch bark and eyes that had not gone soft. He looked his grandson up and down. He looked at the limp. He did not ask about it. He said one thing: "Get your gear inside. We'll talk in the morning." In the morning, he set a tin cup of black coffee in front of Wyatt and pushed 3 things across the table: the keys to the cabin, a Winchester Model 70 chambered in .3006, the bluing worn silver where his hand had rested on it for half a century, and a folded piece of butcher paper. Wyatt opened the paper. It was a map, hand-drawn. The whole trapline. Every set, every cubby, every snare anchor. 40 years of work in pencil and ballpoint. Across the bottom right corner ran a thin blue line marked Black Creek. Everything east of that line was circled in red. "You run it this year," Elias said. "All of it?" Wyatt looked at the red circle. He looked up. "The east side," he said. "The east side," Elias said. "Every set. Every cubby. Don't skip one." Wyatt waited for the rest of it. The warning. The story. The reason. None of it came. The old man drank his coffee and looked out the window at the tree line, and that was the end of the conversation. Wyatt stayed 2 days at the cabin getting his gear in order. He cleaned the rifle. He patched a pair of pack boots. He read the map until he could draw it on a napkin from memory. The East Bank was a roughly triangular piece of country, about 3,000 acres of mixed timber and beaver flats, bordered on the north by a granite ridge and on the south by a stretch of national forest that nobody worked anymore. The trapline crossed the creek at a shallow bend. The old man had marked ford. Past the ford, the line ran east about 4 miles before it looped back on itself. On the morning of the third day, he loaded a pack frame, took down the rifle, and walked down to the water. He stood on the bank for a long minute. The creek was higher than the map suggested. Snowmelt. The water ran black because the bottom was peat and shadow, not because of anything else. He told himself that twice. Then he crossed. The water came up to his belt. The current pushed hard against his bad leg, and the limp got worse on the far side, but he made it. He sat down on a deadfall and emptied the water out of his boots and listened. Birds. Wind in the larch. A woodpecker somewhere up the slope. Nothing else. He shouldered the pack and started up the trail his grandfather had drawn for him. The first set on the east side was a marten cubby nailed to the base of a cedar. It had not been touched in 40 years. The wire was rusted through. The bait box was a soft brown lump of rot. Wyatt knelt beside it and ran his fingers along the cedar bark. He could still see where his grandfather had cut the notch with a hatchet. The cut was clean and confident. The hand of a younger man who had no idea what he was about to walk into. Wyatt rebuilt the cubby. He moved on. By midday, he had walked a little over 2 miles up the line. He had rebuilt 4 sets. He had seen no sign of the walker, no tracks that did not belong to elk or deer or bear, no sound that did not belong to the woods. Whatever his grandfather had seen here in 1985, the forest had taken it back. Then just past the second beaver flat, he found the trail. It was not on the map. It was a fresh cut, 2 ATV tires wide. The brush had been hinged back with a chainsaw, and the stumps were still bleeding sap. The trail came up out of a dry wash from the south, crossed his grandfather's old line at a right angle, and ran east toward the granite ridge. Wyatt stood at the junction for a long time. He could smell the 2-stroke exhaust still hanging in the cedar. Fat, aggressive lugs. A side-by-side, maybe, or a heavy quad. The tracks were less than a day old. The deepest set ran east, loaded. The return set ran west, empty. Somebody was hauling something out of there. He left the old line. He followed the new trail east. Half a mile in, he found the first game camera. It was strapped to a young fir at chest height. The lens was pointed away from the ATV trail. It was pointed up the slope into a thicket where no deer would ever be standing. Wyatt looked at it for a long moment and then walked past it without touching it. He found 3 more cameras in the next mile. All of them faced the wrong direction. None of them were watching game. They were watching the approaches. Anyone walking up that ATV trail from any of the 4 compass directions would be on film before they knew the camera existed. He felt his combat instincts come back the way an old language comes back. He moved off the trail and worked the brush parallel to it. He kept low. He kept the rifle across his chest. A mile past the last camera, he smelled it. Death. Old death. The sweet, thick smell of a gut pile that had been sitting too long in spring sun. He came up over a small rise on his belly and looked down into a shallow bowl in the timber. Stay with me. What he saw in that bowl was the thing his grandfather had been hiding from for 40 years, and the moment Wyatt understood that, the woods around him went very quiet. There were elk in the pit. 6 of them. 5 cows and a young bull. They had been shot, gutted in the field, and dragged into a depression somebody had dug with the same ATV that cut the trail. The heads were still attached. The hindquarters had been taken. The rest had been left. Nobody who was hunting for meat would do that. Nobody who was hunting for antlers would shoot 5 cows. Beside the elk in a separate pile lay the carcasses of 4 black bears. The bears had been opened at the belly, and the gallbladders had been cut out and taken. The paws had been taken. The rest of the bear had been left to rot in the sun. Wyatt had read about this kind of operation in a magazine once, in a waiting room in Fort Hood. Bear gall went to the Asian medicine market for thousands of dollars an ounce. Paws went to private buyers. The rest of the animal was garbage to the people who did this work. He counted 6 elk, 4 bears, 1 pit. This was not a hunter. This was a business. He moved down into the bowl carefully. He kept the rifle ready. He kept his head turning. The smell up close was bad enough to make his eyes water, and he pulled his shirt up over his nose. He walked the edge of the pit and looked at the ground. There were brass casings in the mud at the lip of the depression. He counted 9 of them. Some were old, dulled green by a season or 2 of weather. Some were bright, fresh as that morning. The fresh ones told him this pit had been used recently. The old ones told him it had been used for years. He bent and picked up one of the older casings. He turned it in his fingers and brushed the dirt off the head stamp. It read LC 84. Lake City. Government brass, 1984. The kind of round a sheriff's deputy in northern Idaho would have been issued in 1984. He stood very still in the bottom of that pit with a 40-year-old piece of brass in his hand, and he thought about a man named Curtis Hale. Curtis Hale had been his grandfather's hunting partner in 1985. Curtis Hale had walked out across Black Creek with Elias Vance on a September evening and had not walked back. The official story, the one printed in the Bonner County paper and tucked into a manila folder in a basement somewhere, said Curtis Hale had slipped on a wet log, discharged his own rifle, and fallen into the water with the bullet in his back. The body had been found 2 miles downstream, snagged on a sweeper. The case had closed inside a week. Elias had stopped talking about Curtis Hale at the funeral and had stopped crossing the creek the same day. Wyatt put the casing in his pocket. He walked out of the pit the way he had come, slow and low, and he was halfway back to the ford before he allowed himself to think the words his grandfather had never been able to say out loud. The walker was not a monster. The walker had been a man. He crossed Black Creek a little after sundown. The water was higher and colder than it had been that morning. He held the rifle over his head, and the limp made him stumble twice, and the second time he went under to his shoulders and came up swearing. He sat on the west bank in the dark with his teeth chattering and listened. Nothing followed him. Nothing was going to. Whatever had been on the east side of that creek in 1985 was on a payroll now, and a man on a payroll does his hunting in daylight. He walked the half-mile up to the cabin. There was a light in the window. Elias was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee in front of him that had gone cold hours ago. He looked up when Wyatt came in. He looked at the wet pant legs. He looked at the rifle. He did not speak. Wyatt set the casing on the table between them. The brass made a small dull sound on the wood. Elias looked at it for a long time. He did not pick it up. "I know what you saw," Wyatt said. The old man closed his eyes. "If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button. There's more coming, and where this goes next is worse than what came before." Wyatt slept 4 hours. He was up before the light. He took the casing out of his pocket and set it in a small Ziploc bag and put the bag in the inside pocket of his coat. He cleaned the rifle and reloaded it. He took the keys to his grandfather's old Ford out of the drawer by the stove. He kissed the old man on top of his head while he was still asleep in his chair, and he drove out the logging road toward town. Sandpoint sat about an hour south. The Bonner County Courthouse was a brick box on Cedar Street with a row of pickup trucks parked nose-in along the curb. Wyatt parked 2 blocks down and walked. He climbed the steps and went in through the front door and asked at the desk for the records office. The clerk was a woman about his age with a tired smile and reading glasses pushed up into her hair. He told her he was researching a death in his family. He gave her a name, Curtis Hale. He gave her a date, September 1985. She wrote it on a slip and went into the back. She came out 20 minutes later with a thin manila folder. He sat at a wooden table near the window and opened it. The folder contained 6 pages. A coroner's report, a statement from Elias Vance, a statement from a deputy named Ray Doolin, a scene sketch, a property receipt for the recovered rifle, a photograph black and white of a wet log on a creek bank. Wyatt read it twice. The coroner's report was clear about one thing. The bullet had entered Curtis Hale's back at a downward angle, just below the right shoulder blade, and had exited through the chest wall above the heart. The entry wound was clean. The exit wound was ragged. The angle the coroner had written was consistent with a fall. Wyatt had seen exit wounds. He had seen what a rifle bullet did when it came out of a man at speed. The wound the coroner was describing was not a fall. It was a shot taken from above and behind, from somebody standing higher up the bank than Curtis Hale had been standing. He turned to the statement from Deputy Ray Doolin. Doolin had been the responding officer. Doolin had been the one to find the body downstream. Doolin had written, in his own hand, that he had been on patrol on Forest Service Road 422 at the time of the incident and had heard the shot from his truck. Forest Service Road 422 was on the east side of Black Creek. There was no legal reason for a Bonner County deputy to be on the east side of Black Creek on a Tuesday evening in September of 1985. The property receipt listed the rifle recovered from the water as a Remington 700 in .3006. The serial number was logged. The receipt was signed at the bottom by the same Deputy Ray Doolin. Wyatt copied the serial number into the back of his notebook. He turned to the photograph. The wet log. The creek bank. He looked at the angle of the brush and the lay of the gravel bar, and he recognized it. It was the ford. It was the place his grandfather had marked on the map as the only safe crossing. Curtis Hale had been shot at the ford. He closed the folder. He gave it back to the clerk. He thanked her. He walked out of the courthouse and down the steps, and he stood on the sidewalk in the spring sun for a long moment, because there was one more thing in that folder he had not let himself say out loud yet. At the bottom of Deputy Ray Doolin's 1985 statement, in the line marked current rank, somebody had written in pencil in a more recent hand, a small note. Promoted sheriff, 1994. Reelected unopposed every cycle since. The man who had filed the report on Curtis Hale's death was the man who currently ran the Bonner County Sheriff's Department. The same man who, 2 days earlier, had waved Wyatt's pickup through a roadblock on the way into the valley with a polite nod and a hand on the brim of his hat. Wyatt drove back up the logging road slowly. He kept the rifle on the seat beside him under a wool blanket. He kept one eye on the rearview mirror. Nobody followed him. The road behind him stayed empty all the way up to the cabin. He found Elias on the porch. The old man had cleaned himself up. He had on a wool shirt and a clean pair of work pants, and he had the .3006 across his knees. He looked smaller than he had the day before. He also looked, for the first time Wyatt could remember, like a man who was about to set down something he had been carrying for a long time. Wyatt sat next to him on the porch step. "Tell me," he said. Elias took a long breath. He looked out at the tree line. He started talking. He said Curtis Hale had come to him in August of 1985 with a problem. Curtis had been running a deep set on the east side, up near the Granite Ridge, and he had stumbled into a poaching camp. A pit. Elk and bear. The same operation Wyatt had walked into the day before, only younger then, just starting. Curtis had recognized one of the men working the pit. A deputy. Curtis was an honest man, and Curtis had said he was going to drive into town and file a report. Elias had told him to wait. Elias had told him they should go together. Curtis had not waited. Curtis had crossed the creek alone on the evening of September 4th, 1985, on his way to a meeting at the courthouse with the sheriff at the time, an older man named Howard Beadle. Curtis had been carrying the casings he had picked up at the pit. He had been carrying photographs he had taken with a little Kodak Instamatic. He had been carrying a notebook with the deputy's name written in it. He had never made it to the courthouse. Elias had crossed the creek the next morning looking for him. Elias had found the deputy at the ford, standing over Curtis's rifle in the water with his own service rifle in his hand. The deputy had looked at Elias across the creek. The deputy had not raised his weapon. The deputy had only stared at him until Elias understood. The deputy had said only one thing. "You weren't out here today, Elias." Elias had walked home. He had buried his friend 3 days later. He had nailed a rusted bear trap above his door that night because he could not think of any other way to mark what had happened. He had never crossed Black Creek again. The old man stopped talking. Wyatt looked at the bear trap above the door. He understood it now. It was not a trophy. It was a confession. It was the only headstone Curtis Hale had ever gotten. Wyatt told him what he had found at the courthouse. He told him about the angle of the wound. He told him about Doolin on Road 422. He told him about the promotion. Elias listened with his eyes closed. When Wyatt was done, the old man opened his eyes and looked at him. "I sent you over there," Elias said, "because you can do what I couldn't. You're not a scared young trapper. You're a soldier. You can walk back out with proof." Wyatt did not answer for a long moment. Then he said, "We're going to need more than a casing." Elias nodded. He said, "I know where they keep the rest." They went back across the creek the next morning before light. Elias walked slower than Wyatt remembered him walking, but the old man knew the ground in the dark in a way that no map could teach. He led Wyatt north of the pit, up a draw Wyatt had not seen on his first crossing, to a low cabin tucked under an overhang of granite. The cabin was not on any map. The walls were tar paper and old plywood. There was a padlock on the door the size of a man's fist. Elias produced a pair of bolt cutters from his pack. He looked at Wyatt. He said, "You ready, son?" Wyatt nodded. The padlock dropped into the moss with a soft thump. Inside the cabin, they found what they had come for. Plastic totes stacked along one wall, each one labeled with masking tape and a marker in a careful blocky hand. Bear gall. Paws. Antler. Hide. In the corner on a folding table sat a chest freezer running off a small generator. Inside the freezer were vacuum-sealed packs of organs, each one tagged with a date and a weight. On a shelf above the freezer sat a green ledger book. Wyatt opened the book. It was a record. Dates. Weights. Buyer initials. Wire transfer numbers. Going back page by page to 1984. The first page of the ledger had a name written at the top. Not initials. A full name in a younger hand than the rest. R. Doolin. Wyatt photographed every page with his phone. He photographed the totes. He photographed the freezer. He photographed the generator and the cabin and the granite overhang it sat under. He took the ledger and rolled it into a dry bag and put the dry bag in his pack. Then he heard the ATV. It was coming up the draw from the south. Slow. In no hurry. The driver did not know they were there yet. Elias looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked at Elias. The old man's eyes were clear and quiet, the way Wyatt remembered them from when he was a boy and his grandfather had been the calmest man in any room. Elias said, "You take the ledger out the north side. You go over the ridge. You don't stop until you're at the state police barracks in Coeur d'Alene. You don't talk to anybody in Bonner County. Not one person." Wyatt said, "What about you?" Elias smiled just a little. He said, 40 years is long enough to be afraid of a man, son. I think I'll have a word with him." He picked up the .3006. Wyatt went out the north side of the cabin with the ledger in his pack and the granite at his back. He climbed the ridge in the gray pre-dawn light. He did not look back until he was on top. From the top he could see the cabin small below him and the headlight of the ATV coming up the draw. He could see his grandfather standing in the open doorway with the rifle across his chest like a man who had finally remembered where he had left something. Wyatt heard one shot. He heard nothing after it. He turned east and went over the ridge. The state police took the ledger. They took the photographs. They took Wyatt's statement, and they kept him in a small interview room with bad coffee for 9 hours. By the end of the second day, a team of state investigators with a federal warrant was on the east side of Black Creek with cadaver dogs and evidence techs. By the end of the week, they had exhumed 3 sets of human remains from a clearing a half-mile north of the poaching pit. One set was identified within 48 hours as a Forest Service ranger who had gone missing in 1991. The other 2 sets took longer. Sheriff Ray Doolin was arrested at his home in Sandpoint on a Thursday morning. He did not resist. The news photograph showed him in his slippers with his hands behind his back and a state trooper at each elbow. The look on his face was not anger. It was the slow, dawning look of a man who had not expected this particular day to ever arrive. The trial took 18 months. Doolin was convicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of second-degree murder, conspiracy, racketeering, and a long list of wildlife violations that the judge read out one by one before sentencing. He got life without parole. The 2 other men who had worked the pit with him over the decades took plea deals and lighter sentences and gave the state every name they had ever known. Elias Vance was found at the cabin in the granite draw with 1 round in his chest and the .3006 still in his hands. The coroner ruled it self-defense and death. The old man had fired first, and his shot had gone through the ATV's windshield and into the shoulder of the man driving it, a deputy named Crane who had been on the payroll since 2003. Crane had returned fire from the ground. Elias had taken 1 round and had lived long enough, the coroner said, to put a second round into Crane's leg before he died. Crane was arrested at the hospital. They buried Elias next to Curtis Hale in the little fenced cemetery behind the Methodist Church in Hope, Idaho. The 2 stones stand about 3 feet apart. Curtis's stone says 1942 to 1985. Elias' stone says 1947 to 2026. Underneath both names, in the same small lettering, somebody had carved the same short line. He crossed the creek. Wyatt stayed. He kept the cabin. He kept the trapline. He kept the .3006. He pulled the rusted bear trap down from above the door and he buried it in the yard, because the thing it had marked was finished now, and the marker was no longer needed. He ran the line that next winter, both sides of the creek, the way his grandfather had drawn it on the butcher paper. He rebuilt every set. He took marten and fisher, and a few coyote, and 1 big lynx that the state biologist came up to look at. The check he got that spring was thin, but it was honest, and it was the first paycheck he had cashed in a long time that he did not have to wash any of the dirt off of. He met a woman in town that summer. She was a nurse at the small clinic in Sandpoint, and she had grown up in the valley, and she had heard the Walker stories her whole life. She asked him once, on the porch of the cabin, what had really been on the east side of Black Creek. He thought about it for a while. Then he said the truth. A man, just a man, with a uniform and a rifle and a freezer full of things that didn't belong to him. She nodded. She did not ask again. In the fall of that year, Wyatt walked down to the ford one evening and sat on the deadfall where he had emptied his boots on the first day. The water was low. The creek ran clear over the gravel. The peat smell was gone. He could see straight down to the bottom in the last of the light, and there was nothing in the water that did not belong there. He sat for a long time. He thought about his grandfather standing in the doorway of that cabin in the granite draw with the rifle across his chest. He thought about Curtis Hale walking down to the courthouse in 1985 with a notebook and a roll of film and a debt to pay to honesty. He thought about a boy who had grown up being told there were things in the dark on the other side of the water, and he thought about the man he had become, the one who had crossed that water and found out that the dark was just an absence of witnesses. He stood up. He walked back to the cabin. He shut the door behind him. The light went on in the window, and the valley went quiet, and the creek ran on the way creeks do, carrying off the last of what the spring had loosened from the banks. That was the end of the Walker. That was the end of the silence. That was the end of 40 years.